Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Tuba People TV. We're here in beautiful Los Angeles on the campus of University of Southern California with Boyde Hood.
Thank you.
Wow, I can't believe that I finally get to meet you. And
it's very nice to meet you.
Thank you. I didn't know that you were a student of Mr. Jacobs until I spoke with Sam McMorrin back in Knoxville, and he told me about how when you were a graduate student at Ball State.
Well, actually, I was on the faculty at Ball
State. You were on the faculty.
Yeah,
oh.
I did my master's degree at Ball State in theory and composition while I was concurrently on the faculty.
Okay.
So I decided to, since I had so many good friends on the faculty who were composers and that I hung out with, that I needed to get a master's degree anyway, you know, for the educational thing, and it seemed like a logical thing to do. I'd always been a theory and composition geek, so.
So you were.
I was the trumpet professor at Ball State.
Okay.
And then concurrently, just went ahead and got my master's degree. My wife did the same thing. She was a TA and then joined faculty for a year in the English department.
Yeah. And
so we were kind of doing the same thing there.
Sand said that one day you said, "Sand, we're going to get a lesson with Mr. Jacobs."
We're going to get a lesson with Mr. Jacobs, and we hopped in the car on that Saturday and drove up.
Well, when did you first encounter Mr. Jacobs?
Well, I think like most people, I encountered him orally through all of those wonderful Brian of Chicago recordings, because that brass section was really at that time sine qua non. I think. I mean, the Cleveland, arguably as great a brass section, and it was. I mean, all of those brass sections were really good, but the Brian of Chicago was really quite famous. I was just thinking about this coming in, that we all knew the brass sections with with Bernie and Tom Woolwinder and Ron in Cleveland, and the wonderful New York Philharmonic, in the 50s with Vacchiano and Nate Prager and John Ware, Bill Bell, and of course Philadelphia and Boston. They all had their unique identity. Was what I still find very interesting to me, because that's what we grew up with. Was each orchestra had its own sound and very identifiable, and each brass section had its own sound. And the Chicago brass section, of course, really right up and down the line, like in all the orchestras, was just marvelous. You know, starting with Bud and Jacobs and Frank and all the guys going right down to Arnold Jacobs. And so I was introduced to that sound, and I always loved his playing, primarily on Strauss, which is what I heard first. And I always remembered hearing the writer conducts Wagner the first time, because the way he played that solo in Meistersinger was unique to Jake. It always sang. It always boom, 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 boom. Had life to it, and so I always had admired him. Obviously, as we all did, and I first really heard about his teaching when I was in the orchestra in Milwaukee. Rick Metzger was going to see Jake, and Rick's a marvelous player, marvelous guy, and he mentioned Jake to me, and I was studying with Bud at the time, and so. I had studied the 3 years I was in Milwaukee. I studied with Bud, and then when I accepted the position at Ball State, there were still things that I was concerned about in my breathing and my air that felt a little bit that way. And so I thought, well, Rick talked so much about him, as did so many people. I thought I would give him a call, and so I did. And he was wonderful. I mean, he was so warm, open, conversational. I mean, it was like he was just the nicest guy in the world. He didn't really know me. He said, "Oh yes, well, Bud has mentioned you, and marvelous player." And I explained to him what I wanted to, do. Possibly every couple of weeks come up, and he said, "Well, that'll be fine." That wonderful voice of his. And so, in the fall of '67. I drove up to Chicago with a dear friend, George Corwin, who was the choral conductor. George and I were in school together at Eastman, And so we drove up, and we went downtown and dropped George off at Carl Fisher and Rose's Records, and I went out to Normal Avenue and had my first lesson with him. And I think for the first time in my life, I had a sense that I was finally talking to someone who really knew what they were talking about, as far as breathing, as far as the physiology, and also as far as he articulated it, I thought, very well, the importance of the mind in the activity of playing a musical instrument or really doing anything. Throwing a football, shooting a basket. You look at the basket and your batting average goes way up, rather than thinking, okay, now I'm going to hold it like this. And, he was the first person that really, I had great examples of that, because my first teacher, Mr. Resch, always emphasized that. When I was in high school, he taught at SMU. And then when I went to Eastman, I had the performance examples of that with Sidney Mayer, wonderful player. He was the first trumpet in the Rochester Philharmonic during the 50s and 60s, those wonderful Howard Hanson recordings. Well, that's it. And then watching Bud play, when he would play for me in lessons, there was always this sense of it being totally uncluttered, but you would look at their eyes. And I mean, when Sid would play for me or Bud would play for me, I mean, I could have been in Australia for all they knew. So I had that example of the focus and how the mind is involved, and you always hear that 90% of playing the trumpet or any endeavor is in your mind. Well, it is. And with Jake, he articulated not only the actual physiology of this, but the symbiotic relationship between our mind and our body, and the fact that the mind should always be in control. And I would hearken back then to watching Bud or watching Sid, listening to Mr. Resch, and it always was the kind of thing that was there in pieces. And finally with Mr. Jacobs, he explained things so well that you had a sense that I almost sort of went, okay, finally, someone who really knows, what he's talking about with all this. Because as you know, there's so many myths, there's so many urban legends about breathing and how to do this, and I talked about this once with Manny Klein, a famous studio player here in town when I first came to town, and he had mentioned once that he said that the same kind of thing, that people were always talking about breathing and doing all, don't raise the shoulders, push down, do all this stuff, and he actually started with Schlossberg. And at one point, after 4 or 5 years, when he was working around town hearing this stuff, he said, I asked Mr. Schlossberg, I said, you've never said anything about breathing, and I'm hearing so many ideas about it and all. What are your thoughts on breathing? And he said, Schlossberg looked at me and he said, well, Manny, if you don't breathe, you die. And I told Manny, I said, that sounds like Bud and Jake. Bud always said, I take a breath and blow. And Jacobs always said, this is a natural endeavor. Yeah. That breathing is a very natural endeavor. Right. And that anything that we do that does not follow the rules of the body is going to impede that natural endeavor. Right, okay. And so that was, my first lesson, I was so impressed with everything, but I told my friend George when I went downtown to pick him up, we had to buy tea and then drove back to Muncie. He said, well, how was your lesson? I said, there was so much information, and I said the same thing. I finally feel like I'm talking to someone who knows what he's talking about, but right now the only thing I can remember is ho, because he always told everyone to say, ho when they breathe in. I found for me in subsequent years that ah seemed to work better because it follows the esophagus. Ho, there was a little bit at the back of the tongue. Ah, just kind of opened it up more, but it was that idea. So that was the beginnings for me of actually articulating it, I think, in my mind, as something other than, gee, I think I'll try this, quote unquote.
Okay, great. It sounds like a wonderful first experience with Mr. Jacobs, just getting to be using more air. Was there anything particular that specifically that you remember?
Well, I think the major thing that I remember was spending the hour with him, getting the idea that the body should, first of all, be relaxed. That any tension in the body was counterproductive to the body functioning rather, in its most natural state, if you will. And so we spent time breathing, we spent time just blowing air into the mouthpiece, we spent time just playing long tones on the mouthpiece to get that sense of the relaxation, of not doing something to breathe, just relaxing, breathing, and playing. And I was able to identify quickly with that because I remember, here again, watching both Sidney Meyer and Herseth, and with both Sid and Bud, you almost had a feeling that they didn't breathe. I mean, Bud, the first time he played a Charlier for me, he just like, okay, Red, well, let me just play a bit of this. Gosh, you didn't breathe. And then you realize it's all a part of the process, that breathing is part of music. Well, with small things that can creep in, the way that Jake Bud always approached it by example, I think. Jake approached it from the standpoint of really being able to articulate it, to explain how the body functions, the whole idea of the collapse, the whole idea of the bellows.
So the sternal collapse.
Yeah, so that the body is just, its collapse is based on the needs of the music, the needs of the embouchure, high, middle, or low. It's not that it's anything that you're even aware of, as long as you're out in front with your strong concept of sound and you simply breathe and you play, then you allow the body to function rather than make it function. And I think that was one of the big things I got in the first lesson. And as I said, the idea of saying ho, of not, because a lot of times we tend to have our tongue too high, and just all of a sudden there was all this air going in. And the first thing he gave me was a breathing tube that he had a whole bunch of them. It was a respirative connecting tube, 3/4 inch. And you can still get them in plumbing supply houses, the 3/4 inch tube. And I found that to be still one of the most beneficial aids to me, to remind me in the morning, just because the air's in and you realize, my Lord, that was nothing to breathe. And I think that was important, that first lesson, to realize that all that air goes in and it takes no effort at all. Nothing, you know. And it's been a great tool. In fact, all of my students, I just say, here, now we're going to talk. Okay, you know. But it was that idea that the air could go in totally unimpeded, and then you just breathe and you play. The way I've articulated it for myself is constantly connecting air to sound, so that the idea is that the air is always in motion. I mean, like you talk. When you talk, you don't go, and then you just, and then I'm going to do this and that.
Right.
And so the important thing is that natural connection between the air and either talking or the musical sound. That is really, I felt, was probably the most important thing I got that first lesson. Relaxing the air and just the idea that there is a connection there. And then, as I said, then I hearkened back to both Sid and Bud, and it was the same thing. So between that and the hoe, I really, it just completely changed my way of thinking.
Wow, just in that first lesson.
In that first lesson, completely altered my way of thinking, and also got me back into more mouthpiece practice, which was very, very important. I'd always done a little bit. Mr. West would start with 5 or 10 minutes before the lesson. Sid was like Bud. Sid would mention things. He would say, well, if you maybe play on the mouthpiece for 5 or 10 minutes in the morning, it feels better, I think. And Bud just happened to mention it, everything from the big mouthpiece, which he used. I'd heard about it, guys in Boston doing that with alto trombone mouthpieces and all that. It was too big for me. With Bud, we were on the porch one day, and after a lesson, he said, well, Red, I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Got to play some Brooklyn tonight. I'm going to go downstairs and play on my big mouthpiece. I thought, oh, yeah, I've heard about that. A month later, same thing. Well, Red, I'll see you in a couple of weeks. You're going to go down and play on my big mouthpiece. Come play some Mozart tonight, you know. So I thought, I got in the car and I thought, okay, that's two. You know, let's go get one. And so it was that way. I mean, you had to listen to Bud because he wasn't one that says, okay, you go. The only thing he made me do was get an impression of my teeth.
Just in case you had an accident?
In case I had an accident. That's the only thing that he did. And in fact, I had one 2 years ago. Yeah. My front teeth are all new now.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
But he, because the first time he mentioned it, I sort of said, okay, yeah, I'll do that. I've been meaning to do that. I'll call my dentist at some point. He said, no, for your second lesson, that's your assignment. And I looked at him, he said, look, when I was, younger, I would always go out and visit my brother in Seattle, who's a dentist, and he was always bugging me about getting the impression made. And finally, one Christmas, just to get him off my back, I did it. And he said 2 months later, I went through the windshield of the car. Yeah. He said, without it, wouldn't have had it. And so that was some, Bud would talk about stuff like that. In fact, I even asked him one time, I said, does it bother you that you can't feel your embouchure? And he said, no, not really, Red. It'd just be another thing for me to worry about. Right. So there was this environment that I was learning things in, and with Jake, everything became very focused, and specific. He would explain it in a different way. Sid and Bud by example, or they'd mention it. Jake, as I said, you felt like, okay. And the concept of relaxing the body, of not having muscles in isometric conflict in the body, of just simply you put up the mouthpiece and you have a clear picture of that sound and you connect every sound. And that first lesson just changed everything for me. And then I really started practicing on the mouthpiece. Page 16 was the first thing I did, one line at a time, mouthpiece, trumpet, mouthpiece, trumpet. And it was because of that first lesson. The freight train started going in a different direction.
That's great. So your first lesson, that was fall of 1967?
Fall of 1967, I think it was probably October.
And then after that first lesson, do you remember when you came back, and why did you come back?
I think I was so taken by the importance of that first lesson that I couldn't wait to get back 2 weeks later. And for the next 3 years, when possible, with weather and everything, I would go up every 2 weeks. And I would just go, and each time something got better. I learned something more. And it was in that environment that I thought, how sometimes you realize that, okay, this is a special time. This is a very special time. I'm going to take advantage of this. And so I just, as I said, when I could, with weather permitting and our schedules, or they'd be on tour, or I had something at Ball State I was doing, it was every 2 weeks.
Do you remember any getting past that initial time with maybe the more relaxed, the breathing? Was there anything in subsequent lessons? You mentioned getting something new, more information. Do you remember any specifics about?
I think one of the things that I found amusing, and this was probably in the maybe third or fourth lesson. At Ball State, I had a lot of female students, and they were taught that at that time, seemingly a Midwest thing, you don't raise your shoulders, and you tighten the diaphragm, and you sit like this. And it was so hard to get them to take a breath. And so I came into a lesson, it was probably the third or fourth lesson, I said, Mr. Jacobs, I have a question for you. I'm running into a problem. He said, really? I said, well, it's not with me. This is all feeling good. And I explained the problem with my female students. And Jake laughed, and he said, I run into this all the time. He said, let me show you something. And he stood up, and he had, those medical posters. So there was a male figure, there was a female figure. And he said, let me show you something. I said, okay. And so he did an overlay. He said, okay, there are the lungs, male and female. Okay. All right, now here is the esophagus and the stomach. Okay. Okay, now here is the liver. And he started going through all of the internal organs, and all of a sudden, how light starts to go on, and I thought, I know where he's going. And finally he did the last one, maybe the pancreas, the lower intestines, whatever. And he said, okay, that's it for us. And I thought, yep. He said, now, here are the fallopian tubes. Here are the ovaries. He said, for us, we have the bellows like that. Girls have to breathe intercostally because their bellows can't go down as far. And I remember saying, I said, of course they have more hardware than we do. Mm-hmm. And he started laughing. He said, I'm going to use that. But it suddenly it just made sense. And that was one of the biggest eye-openers, AIDS, because I came back, and my first student that Monday when I came back was one of the girls, Linda or Jeanette, one of the girls, and I told her the story. And at the end of the story, she looked at me and she said, my Lord, I'm a girl. I should know that. I said, I know, but when you're told how to breathe and how to tighten and squeeze this. And so I gave her a breathing tube, mm-hmm. and all of a sudden, she took a breath and she said, oh my God, is it okay to do that? She said, that feels so wonderful, just to breathe and play. And she took a breath and started playing. And I with all of my female students at Ball State at the time, and subsequently through the years, that's the first thing I do, and I tell them the Jake story, because it was really important. In fact, it was funny, the next couple of days, there'd be a knock on the door if one of the girls was next, and she said, I understand you have a story for me. She wouldn't tell me what it was. And so and they all had the same reaction, that suddenly it just freed them up. And I thought, what a nice tangential benefit of the lessons that I'm having with Jake, that I can find out something like that mm-hmm. you know, but you don't think about as an important part of what we're doing, mm-hmm. or an important factor in this whole thing. But it is an important factor. The lungs are true balloons. They fill up. Mm-hmm. Well, with us, they do that. With the girls, they do that.
So you gave permission for your female students to have more sternal lifting.
Yeah, and just say, breathe. And when they did, of course, there was more lifting that we would have. And they said, so I should lift my chest? I said, no. Breathe. Just breathe. Mm-hmm. That will happen. And he constantly said things, and I remind my students about this now, like, you must always follow the rules of the body. Mm-hmm. Follow the rules of the body. Don't get in the way of it. Just, and your body will tell you, basically, what you need to do. Because I find if I'm getting in the way, I'm doing something funny, and I know it right away. And so that was one of the first rules of the body. We have a bellows, they have a bellows, but the intercostal expansion has to be there, because there's no place else for the air to go. And that's what caused a lot of constriction and so forth and so on. So from that standpoint, in one of the early lessons, it was just crucial for me, in my role as a teacher at Ball State, to help the female students, but also it gave me a better perspective on, with the bellows idea of what we do, mm-hmm. that the lungs expand. This idea of developing the diaphragm and strengthening the diaphragm. The first thing he said was, because I asked him about that, he said, good Lord, no. He said, the diaphragm is the strongest muscle in the body. It's working 24 hours a day. The diaphragm responds to the needs of the body. Mm-hmm. Whether you're doing any physical activity, sports activity, musical activity, the diaphragm, or bodily activity, the diaphragm responds to it, mm-hmm. And so, because he always made the point, he said, when you cough or you have a bowel movement, that's a physical activity, yeah. And the diaphragm responds. You don't think about tightening your diaphragm to cough, right. And he said the same thing is true playing the instrument, have a clear picture of what you want the sound to be, and Bud always said that too. Mm-hmm. And back to said, he said, well, I know what you want to sound like. So it was that idée fixée that was constantly there. Mm-hmm. And so he would just say, okay, now then, just know what you want to sound like. And all of the teachers of the generation before me said the same thing, and we said the same thing. Bub would look at me and say, you can't hear it, you can't play it. Mm-hmm. And it was that simple. No fat on the meat, uncluttered, you can't hear it, you can't play it. And that was the idea with Jake as well, that you had to hear it, but you also had to get out of the way of the body. Yeah. And that was the thing, watching Bud. It didn't look like he was doing anything. you know, and
Right.
subsequently over the years, many great players, it's been the same thing.
When Mr. Jacobs had you playing the mouthpiece, did he have you play melodies or drill forms or both? Or?
He had me play, as I said, we started page 16 in the Arvin book. He had me play melodies. He had me play a whole variety of things.
Okay.
He said, find out what's comfortable for you. It really doesn't matter, although he preferred melodies rather than drill forms. But with my mouthpiece drill that I developed in the mid-70s, the thing that I've come to is that there are no exercises. There's only music. And that's not a convenience, you know. That's true. There's only music. It's how you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think about the mouthpiece drill I do in the morning. I start on the big mouthpiece. I go to the a visualizer that I designed with Merle Hireman at Getson in 1964 when we were in Milwaukee.
Wow.
And then, because that was kind of the order of things Bud did. The big mouthpiece, he liked the visualizer. Then I just use all the mouthpieces in my drill that I normally play on, so the familiarity is there. Like with the big mouthpiece, you don't have to play high on it. You just have that familiarity. And so that was basically the idea of it. Was that with the mouthpiece practice, he preferred, I think, melodies so that he felt you were more musically stimulated. But if something else worked, in my memory, that seemed to be fine with him. Totally.
Good. What was your length of study with Mr. Jacobs? So you started in the fall of '67. When do you think your last lesson was?
My last lesson was probably in the spring of 1970. Because in the fall of 1970, I joined the faculty at the University of Victoria, British Columbia, on Vancouver Island, where we were for 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
I actually joined the faculty at UVic as a composer. For 2 years, I organized the freshman theory course, taught 2 years of composition, first and second year of the composition majors, and taught the orchestration class. And I was playing, first time at the Victoria Symphony, also in the Vancouver CBC Orchestra. Taught in the summertime at the Courtney Youth Music Center, which was the Vancouver Symphony kind of sponsored camp in the summertime, which was wonderful. So, but my last lesson would have been probably in May, because as the summer came, we were packing the house, and I just didn't have time to go out. So I remember calling him and just thanking him for everything. And it was nice in subsequent years, especially when I came to Los Angeles and joined the Philharmonic. He recommended me to quite a few students who said, I'm not able to come out to Chicago right away, but I'm really having these problems. And he would say, well, and these are the students telling me this. He said, first thing he said was, well, call Boyde Hood. I think I know he's in the Philharmonic there now, and he's on the faculty of USC, so give him a call, and he can help you with this. Mm-hmm. Which I felt was such a marvelous thing. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how to describe it. I was so...
A real stamp of approval.
Yeah, it's a confidence.
Yeah.
I think maybe that he had in my ability to... Because I had sent students back to Chicago to study, who played in Civic and all, to study with Bud and with Jake. Mm-hmm. And they talked about how, I had, constantly told them about what my experiences had been with both Jacobs and Herseth. And I just always, I guess the only way I can put it, really appreciated the confidence. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm curious, trumpet player, LA Phil, Dallas Symphony,
Rochester Philharmonic, then
long list of excellent ensembles and high level performing, and studying with a tuba player, and a lot of people think of why a tuba player, especially you play the trumpet, that's a radically different amount of air and that sort of thing. How did that interface? How did that work out in terms of larger breaths and pressures and getting rid of the air fast enough, all that kind of stuff?
Well, first of all, you don't think about it because with a brass instrument, trumpet, horn, trombone, baritone, tuba, whatever, it's all the same thing. It has to do with allowing your body to respond to what is in front of you. Whether it's a trumpet, a piccolo trumpet, or it's an alto trombone, or it's an E-flat tuba or an F tuba, which you guys play. I mean, all of that is irrelevant in a way to the basic process and procedure. And this is what he taught. He also taught wind players. He had a lot of singers in Chicago who came to him who were commercial singers, because they it had to be right and it had to be a certain way, and they would tend to constrict a bit. So he taught everyone. Someone told me that it might have been Bud, that every time they went on tour, that Ray Still saw to it that Jake was sitting next to him. Absolutely. And he said, man, they were going the whole time talking about stuff. That Ray constantly was asking him questions and working on stuff. And my God, with an oboe, you have all of that, pressure. But if you think about it, then you're in the wrong room, I think. What he thought about was the idea of relaxing the whole process going in, because, boy, I remember watching Ray Still play, and because he came to Courtney two or three summers, and he would just put the oboe in, and it didn't look like any other oboe you'd ever seen. It just was beautiful sound would come out. And
I remember reading. He said he never had a lesson with Jake, but he considered himself a student.
Yeah.
Mr. Jacobs.
Yeah, well, as I said, on tour, but I guess during intermissions, that they were talking all the time about this. So it didn't matter that Jake was a tuba player and I was a trumpet player, or Ray Still was an oboe player. The point was that the concept was the important thing. The following the laws of the body and allowing the body to respond to the endeavor, whether that endeavor is trumpet, oboe, or singing.
Did you work on piccolo trumpet with Mr. Jacobs?
No.
Just big trumpets?
Just the big trumpets. And because I found the piccolo trumpet was the same thing. As long as I didn't think about it, it was very relaxed and easy. And it was just a matter of playing the piccolo trumpet rather than having any idea of how I play the B flat or the C trumpet carrying over into the piccolo. It's like each time I pick up a different trumpet, then that's what I'm playing. I think early on I developed also a movable kind of do. C for me is whatever horn I have in my hands. And that just transferred into my body's responding to the D trumpet, the B flat trumpet, the piccolo trumpet. That is all the same thing. It should all be the same thing. And there again, watching Bud, I mean, you pick up a piccolo and didn't, And so having that example, I think, was always an excellent thing.
Yeah.
And just having that constant example of everything being uncluttered.
That's great.
But I say, for me, I always tell my students, just keep trimming the fat off the meat. And if something you're doing is bothering you, but my question for all of my students is, okay, does it help? And the answer is usually no. Well, let it go. But that's your job to let it go.
Yeah.
Only you can do it, And then they get the idea that they're in charge. That, okay, I'm not going to do it for you. I can take you up to a certain point, but that last 5 or 10%, whether it's me studying with Jake and Bud or my students studying with me, you will figure it out on your own from that point. Always.
Mr. Hood, I'm wondering if there was you had significant study with both Mr. Herseth and Mr. Jacobs. Was there any do you remember what one might have said about the other within the context of teaching or pedagogical issues?
Not so much pedagogical issues with Bud. I just remember a couple of times he said, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, but that Jake was the reason they sounded the way they did. That sound on the bottom, they just built on that sound. And Jake, the major thing I remember him saying about Bud is that he felt that Bud was a perfect brass player. He said the reason he gets so red in the face is that all the capillaries are firing all at once. And he just felt he was the perfect brass. Imagine Bud playing it, and then you imagine yourself doing it, So that was, those were the two things that always stuck out in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, they were definitely firing all those capillaries.
Oh my God! I mean, it was disconcerting the first couple of lessons because he'd start to play for me, and in a couple of bars he was beat red.
Yeah.
And you think, oh my gosh, are you okay? And you go, no, I've seen concerts, you know. And then I realized with me that when people would ask me, "Are you okay?" was when I felt the best, and they said, "God, you get so red in the face." I said, "Well, it's working."
Well, I remember seeing Mr. Herseth say that. On the subject of him turning red, he says, "Well, I just like to let people know in the audience that he's working, working for them."
Well, you know, again, I remember he said in a couple of the master classes he did at the Music Academy of the West, in the 90s, was the last time I saw Bud. I went up with some of my students, and in the last class, afterwards, I remember someone came up and said, "Well, Mr. Herseth, gosh, it's such a pleasure to hear your lecture." "Well, thank you very much." He said, I've always loved the sound of the Chicago Symphony brass section, so strong, and you're so powerful and strong on the top." And he said, "Well, they don't pay me the big bucks to hide in the weeds." And I remember the young player said, "Yeah, but what if you miss a note?" And he looked at him and he said, "So?"
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, that's the best lesson you're going to get.
Yeah.
So, if that's in your head, you know.
In the wrong business.
But that was the way he thought. He was asked the question at one point, "How do you deal with performance anxiety?" And he said, "I don't get nervous. I can't help you." Next. And a couple of my students went, I said, "No, he just told you the truth."
Mm-hmm.
And one of the last things, in the last class, I was at the end, and the hand went up, said, "Mr. Herseth, it's been a great class, thank you very much." I remember the setting the sun was coming in and all. Are there any final words of advice that you could give us that would really help us in our endeavor to do this? And he stood there for a second, and I thought, here it comes. I said, "Yeah, practice." And again, my students went, "Rah, rah, rah, rah." I said, "No, he just told you, practice." And that was how he basically thought. It was just very clear.
Did you, aside from that phone call in 1970 with Mr. Jacobs, did you see him after that, just casually or socially?
When they came on tour here, I got to see him, both he and Bud. When we were on tour with Giulini, my second year in the orchestra, we had a night off when they had a concert. They did Bruckner 6th, I remember, marvelous concert. And Bud invited me to go out with he, and I guess they had a Thursday night group that went out to a pizza place over in Wabash, I think, because it was cold and windy. And we went out for a great meal afterwards, and we talked and wanted to know, what had happened with me in the intervening years, and he'd heard nice things about, I was chairman of the orchestra committee, and he'd heard really nice things about what I'd been able to do with the contract and the negotiations and all. And we talked in that kind of environment. But the last thing I remember is he was taking me back to my hotel. We were walking, and it was, you forget about the wind in Chicago. You do. And I was saying, "My God, I forgot about the wind." He started laughing. He said, "Yeah, you do. You forget about it." And we laughed and got in the car, and that was the last time that I saw him in Chicago. As I said, I saw him out here and saw him on tour. But the first time, Bud and George Vosberg and I think Avis was probably with Bud. I took him to one of my favorite Mexican restaurants out in the valley, Casa Vega, and we had a great meal. But then found out that Bud was a sushi nut like I am.
Oh.
And so when they came on tour, I would just take them down to a place in Little Tokyo, Ichiban. It's really sensational. So we had that kind of we would go out and then after a concert and have a meal and talk and just talk about all kinds of stuff, And so it sort of, the relationship continued whenever it was possible to see them. But it was just like we were colleagues, and we'd go to parties afterwards. I went out to Bill Lane, who was our wonderful principal horn player, Bill Lane's house one time, and just had a great time, and they just really enjoyed it. And I picked him up at the hall and got him back to the hotel. And So there was that kind of a personal relationship that continued, which I was very grateful for because they were two extraordinary people.
Yeah, that's for sure. Really bookends.
Oh, they were
Amazing
bookends.
bookends.
That's why we sound the way we do.
It's really the perfect storm between those two people, Bud and Jake and Fritz Reiner.
Yeah.
And all the other really excellent musicians of the Chicago Symphony.
Well, one thing
and RCA Victor.
Yeah. One of the things too that they're putting out now on Video Artists International are the great music from Chicago.
Yeah.
And the first thing I have my students get is the one with on the DVD now, it's the Hindemith.
The Hindemith concert music.
And then the Beethoven Seventh with Reiner is after that. And I say, okay, this is what they sounded like with Reiner. Because you just had that right at the end of the first movement. Suddenly, it's like that 1, 2, or 3 times in the concert.
Yeah.
I remember they did a Symphony Fantastique in Milwaukee when I was studying with Bud. And all the way through, it was strong, it was big, it was in the Pabst Theater. But right at the very end, where that da-da-ga-da-da-ga-da-ga-da, all of a sudden it was like da-da-ga-da-da-ga-da-da-ga-da-da-ga-da-da-ga-da-da-ga-da, and all the bells went up.
Yeah.
And I swear, I remember it's almost like you were pinned back against your seat.
Yeah.
But it was a wall of sound.
Yeah.
But they saved it.
Yeah. Right.
And when it came, man, it came. It was really something.
Well, this has been really a fun time, and I'm so appreciative. And thank you, Sam McMorrin, for cluing me in about.
Thank you, Sam. I hope all is well.
Mr.
I
Hood.
have so many fond memories of Ball State and our friendship, and I just hope to see you sometime soon.
And if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to give you as a token of appreciation this genuine Tuba People TV glass.
Oh, thank you very much.
I encourage you to put your favorite beverage inside.
I will do this.
And then
I will do this.
Slowly eliminate it.
I will, yes. Oh, maybe a not-so-wee dram of the Highland.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mike.
It's great to see you.
Great pleasure.